I'm out on the far west end of the main 6-acre edible acre nursery, and just finished a day of planting a bunch of trees and doing some nursery work, planting out some perennial gingers and other fun new plants. And I thought I'd wind down a little bit after a long day and walk around with you folks and show you what's going on in this relatively new area. So stick around. We've been putting a lot of effort into this relatively new clearing for the last few years. If you can imagine, about 6 years ago, this was nearly closed canopy. A lot of Scots pine overstory, tremendous amount of European buckthorn. You can see the legacy of them still standing in the landscape, passing away and the like. We went through and cut down Japanese honeysuckle, a lot of, quote-unquote invasives and other high density plants, and now there's this big open glade. So there's a prerogative. If I'm going to put in the disturbance, do the actual disturbance of a space and open up for light and access, it's really on me, it's on us if we're going to do that to actually facilitate succession. A lot of the work that we've been doing on this far end is, as the trees get dropped, it's using an electric chainsaw to chop them up into haulable or movable pieces. In fact, this area right here, this was done just last year, and basically including the stumps of the trees. So in here there were 3 or 4 18-inch diameter Scots pine, 30 or 40-year-old trees. We felled them, took the trunks, laid them to basically make one large permanent raised bed in hugel mound style over those stumps, and used an electric chainsaw to chop up the branches a bit and lay them up. And now, as time allows, we're trying to harvest soil and get this hugel mound capped so that it can become a productive permanent raised bed. And part of that strategy is hand digging ponds that are in proximity of where these future beds will be. And so then we have a ready source of not the most nutrient rich, but at least it's mineral soil that can go on as a weight and as a way to start breaking down some of these beds. And so like this one, pretty young pond, it has definitely not started sealing at all. At some point we may have animals in this landscape to help with that process. But you can see by capping these beds with that soil, this is a very young, immature space. It's been dry lately. We're supposed to get an inch or two of rain soon. Well, you can see it's moist right underneath. But basically what we'll do is let this rest for a bit, and then as time allows, come through after a good rain, scratch this up, and then seed it out to a nice diverse mix of annuals just to see how it goes. That sort of design or approach, it's a real long-term goal sort of scenario. We won't expect anything production-wise out of these early on, but I think once they start producing, it'll be just an accelerating amount of fertility and greatness out of these. I'm looking forward to seeing how these piles of debris evolve over time. If I zoom out a few years, that same basic process that I was just describing of felling trees, laying their tops, and then hand digging ponds and using that soil to cap those woody debris piles, that's this a few years later. So these ponds are becoming more mature and more stable. They actually hold water pretty nicely. They're very, very clear, which makes me quite happy. And I was thrilled to see the other day, I came out here and there was a pair of wild ducks that were swimming around in here. I spooked them, which I'm bummed that I did, but I'm sure they'll be back. And now that this context has started mellowing, of course it gets weedy pretty quickly, but there's also an opportunity to plant some long-term later succession plants into the mix. So you can see here, just to the north of these ponds, are some Ménage Meru blackcurrant, and just to the north of them are sea buckthorn, which will fill out eventually and become the overstory. And they really enjoy the warmth from this water and the reflected sunlight. It's a lovely little scene. And there's even a hand-dug well, quote unquote. My friend Andy helped me dig and set in. Thanks, Andy. This was an old rusted out metal drum that I had that I used to make biochar in. Drilled some holes in the bottom, dug down deep enough to set that very deep in there. That stick is so that in case an animal falls in, they can climb out. And we may be able to use a bilge pump and a solar panel this summer to lift some water from here. So nice functional little elements in the landscape. And that complexity of the pit and mound, the water and the better drained, in juxtaposition of each other. It's a very dynamic, it's complex, it's hard to manage, but it's a very dynamic and very alive space for sure. Last summer I made a barter arrangement with a friend who runs a small annual crop CSA farm that in the summer I could borrow his BCS walk-behind tractor that has a rotary plow. I borrowed that for 3 days, and my good friend Juan came over, and Sasha and we worked for a 3-day weekend and basically used that tool to dig out these much deeper drainage trenches. So after a rain, this will fill with about a foot or two of water right up to the bottom of these beds. And we harvested that soil, put them right on top of the logs that were here, and last fall seeded them out to our garlic crop. So this is a young hugel mound, but capped very thoroughly with soil, planted out at a nice high density and mulched deeply with hay. I'm looking forward to seeing how well these perform. There's a number of them, and come late July when we harvest the garlic, these should be some incredibly luscious, well-drained and yet moisture available garden spaces that every time we get a real heavy rain, we'll have standing water next to them that can wick in and feed them without drowning the tops or drowning the topsoil that's in there. And this whole walkway was underwater up until a few days ago, and as the warmth of spring increases, it dries out, and the white clover that we sowed in as a ground cover is starting to rebound and do its thing. Tomorrow we're looking at an inch of rain, so I suspect they'll all be underwater again. Maybe at some point we need to do some more like semi-water loving perennial ground covers in this space. You can see we really went nuts with garlic last fall. They're all different states. I'm going to talk about that in a moment, but it's pretty neat to see. Here's another one where we use the rotary plow to dig through and break the soil a little bit, and then shovels to hill it. And you can see the old logs of the trees that were here that are semi-buried but not quite. And we just worked around them and planted the garlic in between those logs. And they're looking just fine. And what's interesting is you can see this garlic looks a little small, a little bit larger, and then way larger. And you say, well, what's going on there? Well, we planted garlic over the course of 6 weeks, and this first planting was done in the 3rd week of September, and they came up very early in the winter, got a little burnt when we got down to around 0 degrees Fahrenheit, but did just fine. So this very early planting, 3rd week of September, same thing with this bed, 3rd week, and then 2 or 3 weeks later, we planted more in mid-October. And so they're getting caught up now, they're playing catch up. And then we planted a bit more in November. And so they're coming up as well. Pretty interesting to see. No matter when you plant garlic, it seems to work out pretty nicely. And you can see everywhere that we use the BCS to disturb soil and create permanent raised beds was filled with garlic. And we'll have around, 3,000 to 5,000 heads coming out in July. Limiting factor will be where the heck do we actually hang all this garlic to dry? My gosh. Beautiful little black currants under the shade cast by an apple tree branch. They love the partial shade. They're going to make a lovely crop this year, I bet. They almost always do. We've got some air prune beds set up in the woods here in a very simple way. Just laid some bricks on the ground, laid our air prune boxes, which I talked about last summer, some with risers, and the ones with caps are all planted out to chestnut, and we put the hay against the side to protect them. Starting to explore putting these air prune beds out in the woods where it's these new open sunnier spots to set them up over what was a mowed area or a lawn, and we'll mulch like crazy all around them, grow them for the season. When we take these trees out in the fall, we can just simply flip the air prune beds, dump them out, and have hopefully weed-free permanent beds here, and then move those bricks and air prune beds over to a new spot for a season so we can grow a few thousand trees, kill the lawn that's there, and prep it as a permanent raised bed. We'll see how that goes. But you can see lots of material in here, hoping for some good rains and some time to harvest more soil to cap these with and get these all set to winter squash in not too long a time, another week or two. And we need to figure out where the potatoes are going to go this year. We have a few hundred pounds of seed we're trying to set in back in these areas to pioneer new spaces to grow in. I wonder if you can have too much garlic. I'm going to think the answer is no. We'll find something to do with it, but it's a crazy amount. Lovely, crazy amount. Walking out towards the northwest corner of the property line is just somewhere in that hedgerow there, and it segues over to our neighbor's orchard. And this clearing is pretty significant, and you can see where the sun is coming down. As we get into the summer, late day sun is a very strong influencer in this area. It actually gets pretty hot and pretty windy through here, so I'm starting to really plant out what can happen in this last area. I've committed about 15 different varieties of willows right along the property line. I'll show those in a moment. And today I spent some time, I used my little electric riding mower with a trailer attached to bring some bare root trees out. They're a little buried right now, but each of these are the shrub layer of a guild. We'll add in the herbaceous perennials later on, but they're each a keystone. Let me find one that's a little bit easier to see. These are grafted apples or pears that I grafted last year or the year before. They're planted to the north of a nitrogen fixing shrub. In this case, we've got gumi. So there's different varieties of gumi all through here. And to the west, we've got a blackcap raspberry that can weave its way through the fence and be a little bit of a protection from deer. And what's fun about this combo is when you have a nitrogen fixer to the south of your keystone tree, that'll grow very quickly. We'll get a crop from that in a year or two, and as needed, we can chop that and feed it to our tree as they get established. The thorny spreading layer will give us a crop probably this year and help make more and more of a defensive space around this area so that eventually we can take this ring out, repeat the process elsewhere, and vegetatively have the fencing we need in the form of those blackcaps. Same pattern repeated of gumi. That's a bosque pear and more blackcaps. And then another variety of gumi with a grafted apple and some blackcaps. And then off in that distance, we've got a few male seaberry and a whole bunch of female seaberry. They're upslope of this area. They love the sun. They'll get about 10 to 12 feet tall and help protect from wind and give us a citrus fatty crop while bleeding nitrogen out into the soil. It looks like I planted a bunch of random sticks more than anything, but this was an experiment I did this winter when I had some time. I took some willows that I had rooted last year in a nursery. So you can see here's one leafing out beautifully right now. That was the cutting from last year. So these are all rooted cuttings of willow. And you'll say, well, why do you have these random sticks? Am I trying to root miscanthus or bamboo? So these are all miscanthus stalks. And what I was trialing, and I think it's worked, is everywhere I put a willow, I stuck 4 or 5 of these dead stalks. They won't root, but they're sticking out in this direction so that if deer want to come through and try to browse on the willow, certainly they could. If their minds were set to try to push in there and eat the willow, they could. But if they were just kind of walking by and wondering what's going on, there's a lot of loud, kind of annoying sticks to have to work through that poke them and rustle. They can't be as stealthy as they'd like. And so far, I've had 0 browse from the deer. Now I'm trialing it around hazelnuts and chestnuts, which are much higher targets for deer, but it's a $0 solution. I have to cut the miscanthus each year anyway, and they last for a year or two, and then they'll just break down and return to the soil. But it's kind of this like textured chaos in here with trees I care about, more on this side, and really it's an extra 5 seconds per planting to add them in and $0. So I'm psyched to see that it actually seems promising. Looks weird. It looks like I'm a crazy person, but I am a crazy person, so it makes sense. It's a little bit of a longer winded tour of the far end of our 6-acre property. Creating these openings makes for a lot of exciting opportunity and ethically the imperative to actually do something. So I'd encourage folks, if you're thinking about clearing areas in a landscape, to make sure you're ready. What are you going to plant it with? What's your game plan? To just clear areas and say, oh, I'll get back to it later, is kind of a fool's errand. You're just going to have lots of weeds and lots of stressed out context. So it's fun to get in here and as quick as possible plant as much as we can. I should probably walk away sooner than later. I know there's a wild turkey nesting somewhere in there. I accidentally flushed her out this morning. Beautiful eggs. I hope she raises a million beautiful little babies. I should start spreading some grain out here so they have something nice to nibble on. But it's fun to have these wild creatures choosing this space as their home, along with the plants that we're stewarding. Thanks so much for watching. Hope you're having a lovely spring day. It's so warm and nice. It's been t-shirt weather all day. Loving it. Take care.